subhanahu wa ta'ala. Let's take the example of Umar and Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhuma. That we know Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he used to compete with Abu Bakr to do good deeds. So one day he thought to himself, today with a surety I will outdo Abu Bakr. I'm going to take half of my wealth and give it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this is what Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu did. And then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him, Ya Umar, what have you left behind for your family? And he said, I have left behind half of my wealth. And then at that very moment, Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu comes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with all of his wealth. Brothers and sisters, every single dinar he had to his name, every single extra piece of clothing, every single piece of food or grain that he had, he gave it to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam asked him, Ya Abu Bakr, what have you left behind for your family? And Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he said, I have left behind Allah and His Messenger. Subhanallah al-Azim. Now brothers and sisters, this is not something Islam makes compulsory upon us. This is something, it is just recommended, and it is a story to encourage us to give in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That if mortal human beings before us could do such a deed, then why is it that we can't? Do we not claim that we are better than those that preceded us? But little do we realize that all good of this ummah was with the Salaf. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with them. And in another example of giving wealth in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let us turn back to Surah At-Tawbah. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is describing one of the expeditions that He was going upon. And the people wanted to go out with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, yet they had nothing to give. How does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describe them? Brothers and sisters, think about this. And if this does not bring tears to your eyes, you need to check yourself and increase your iman. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes them as saying, or doing, or feeling, وَأَعْيُنُهُمْ تَفِيضُ مِنَ الدَّمْعِ حَزَنًا وَأَعْيُنُهُمْ تَفِيضُ مِنَ الدَّمْعِ حَزَنًا أَلَّا يَجِدُوا مَا أَنْفِقُوا عَلَيْهِ. That their eyes used to flood with tears. Their eyes used to flood with tears because they could not find anything to give. Now brothers and sisters, look at your situation and the situation of the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum. That they were individuals, when they didn't have anything to give, this is when their eyes would tear up and they would complain. And us, with all the wealth that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has bestowed upon us, with all the bounties and the mercies that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has granted us, we are the ones complaining when we are asked to give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Brothers and sisters, realize that anything that you give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first of all, it will not decrease your wealth. This is a promise from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, that sadaqah will not take away from your wealth. And secondly, anything that you give for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will replace it with something better. When it comes to money and when it comes to wealth, it's not just about the amount that you have, but rather it's about how much you can do with this wealth. As we know, money is a rizq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. From Him it comes, and to Him it returns. There are times all of you are working or have worked at one point in your life, that you may work a week, and then at the end of the week, when you get your paycheck, you realize that all this is going towards bills. And then another week will come where you will have paid all of your bills and you still have money left over. And you're able to do with that money that which you are not able to do with a full paycheck. This is barakah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts in your wealth. But this barakah will only come once you give it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It will not come by holding on to it and being stingy with it. But it will only come when you give it free-handedly. Now look at the example that the Prophet ﷺ gives, and the hadith mentioned by Bukhari and Muslim. When he said, سَبْعَةٌ يُظِلُّهُمُ اللَّهُ فِي ظِلِّهِ يَوْمَ لَا ظِلَّ إِلَّا ظِلُّهُ. That 7 individuals will be shaded in the shade on Yawm al-Qiyamah, a day that there is no shade other than the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now of these 7 individuals, Allah's Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that one of them is the one who gives in such secrecy and privacy that his left hand will not know what his right hand gave. The left hand will not know what the right hand gave. Now, which one of you, in the heat of Yawm al-Qiyamah, when you are drowning in your perspiration, and it feels as if the sun is only inches away from you, would not want to be shaded by the shade of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Brothers and sisters, prepare your nafs, prepare your hearts for giving for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and preparing for the month of Ramadan, the month that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was most generous in. Now, another way that we can prepare for this blessed month of Ramadan is by returning back to one of the very foundations of this deen. Turning back to what our deen is based upon. The guidance, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala calls it. The mercy, the healing, the furqan. Brothers and sisters, it is none other than the Quran. We know that it is in the blessed month of Ramadan that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent down the Quran in this blessed month. And thus it is known as the month of the Quran. Now let me give you one example of the blessing and mercy that lies in the Quran in terms of deeds. In a hadith mentioned by Abu Dawud, and you might not see the correlation from the very beginning, the Prophet ﷺ was sitting with his companions, and a man came in and he said, Assalamu alaikum. The Prophet ﷺ said 10. The Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala anhum, they were astonished. They're like, why would the Prophet ﷺ say a number instead of saying wa alaikum assalam, or by commenting on this person, or by anything else? A second man came in and he said, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. The Prophet ﷺ said 20. Again, the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala are astonished. And then a third man comes in and he says, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. To which the Prophet ﷺ said 30. Now, at this point, the Sahaba radiallahu ta'ala they couldn't handle it anymore. Their inquiries got the best of them, and they said, Ya Rasulullah, why is it that when each man entered in and gave you salams, you repeated a number? The Prophet ﷺ said that a person who comes into a gathering and he says Assalamu alaikum, he has 10 rewards. And a person who says Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, he has 20. And a third individual who says Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, he has 30 rewards. Now, how do I relate this to the Quran? Brothers and sisters, in a hadith narrated by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anhu in Sahih al-Bukhari, in describing the merit of the Quran, he narrates from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as saying that with each letter of the Quran that you recite and enunciate, you get a reward, and each reward is 10 times its like. Meaning, for each letter of the Quran, you get a reward of 10 hasanat. And then he goes on to say, وَلَا أَقُولُ أَلِفْ لَامْ مِيمْ حَرْفٌ وَلَكِنْ أَلِفٌ حَرْفٌ وَلَامٌ حَرْفٌ وَمِيمٌ حَرْفٌ. That just for saying alif, lam, mim, words from the Quran, the first 3 letters from Surah Al-Baqarah, you get the same reward as saying Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And we all know of the great station that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave to the salams in Islam. That Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam has said, لن تدخلوا الجنة حتى تؤمنوا ولن تؤمنوا حتى تحابوا أولا أدلكم على شيء إذا فعلتموه لتحاببتم أفشوا السلام بينكم. That he said, none of you will enter Jannah until you believe, and you will not believe until you love one another. So shall I not guide you to that thing? If you were to do it, it would increase the love amongst yourselves. Spread the salams amongst yourselves. This is the station that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave to the salams. And then look at its reward. Now if that is the case with just the salams, then how about those actions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives more rewards to? Like the recitation of the Quran. With 3 mere letters, you are getting the reward of saying the whole salams. And saying the salams is something which enters you into Jannah. This is something to reflect upon, brothers and sisters. And likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He raises people with the Quran and humiliates others. Meaning that those people who have memorized the Quran and read the Quran frequently, you can see it on their faces. You can see it in the way they walk and they talk. You can see it in their good morals and manners and in their etiquette. Whereas those people who do not read the Quran and do not memorize the Quran, likewise you can see it on them. They will have the worst of manners. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not bestow His nur upon them. And He will deprive them of good in this life and in the hereafter. As Allah's Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, وَالْقُرْآنُ حُجَّةٌ لَنَا وَالْقُرْآنُ حُجَّةٌ لَكَ أَوْ عَلَيْكَ. That the Quran is a proof for you or a proof against you. Now brothers and sisters, the month of Ramadan is the month of the Quran. And we all have aspirations to recite the whole Quran during this blessed month. We all have this aspiration. Yet the vast majority of us will fall short in the fulfillment of this aspiration. Because those of us who do not give the Quran its due right